At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States experienced a natural disaster so severe that it remains unmatched in American history. It claimed more lives than any hurricane before or since, yet today most Americans barely know it happened. This was the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900, the deadliest hurricane in the United States, a storm so violent that thousands were swept into the sea. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Whole families disappeared within minutes, and Galveston, a city once predicted to become one of America's great coastal capitals, was nearly erased in a single night. Before the storm, Galveston was thriving. The island city was one of the busiest ports in the nation. Wealthy tourists arrived from across the country to enjoy warm beaches and elegant Victorian hotels. Long rows of mansions stood proudly along the shoreline. The city was prosperous, bold, and confident. Newspapers predicted it would soon rival New Orleans and New York in influence. But beneath this optimism lay a dangerous reality. The island sat only a few feet above sea level, and unlike many coastal cities today, it had no seawall, no breakwater, no protection of any kind. Residents believed major hurricanes rarely struck Texas, and that Galveston was naturally shielded by the Gulf's currents. That belief would prove fatal. In early September of 1900, a tropical storm developed over the Atlantic and grew stronger as it moved west. By the time it reached Cuba, meteorologists there observed unmistakable signs that the storm was intensifying rapidly and heading directly toward Texas. Cuban experts issued strong warnings. But political tensions between Cuban meteorologists and the United States Weather Bureau caused American officials to ignore these predictions. The U.S. insisted the storm would curve northeast and pose no danger to Texas. This miscalculation would cost thousands of lives. When the system entered the Gulf of Mexico, ships reported violent winds and massive waves, but communication was slow, and many of these reports did not reach Galveston in time. On September 6th and 7th, Isaac Klein, Galveston's chief meteorologist, noticed troubling signs. The barometer was falling steadily. The tide rose early and aggressively. The Gulf appeared restless. Yet Klein had once publicly written that a direct hit from a major hurricane would not devastate the city. Even he could not imagine the scale of the storm that was now coming. By the morning of September 8th, the sky over Galveston looked strange. Heavy, metallic clouds hung low over the water. The air felt unnaturally warm and dense. Waves crashed onto the beach hours before the storm's center arrived. Water began flooding low streets near the shore before most residents even realized a hurricane was coming. But life in the city continued as usual. Children played near the beach, watching the waves rise. Families stood on porches to enjoy the breeze, unaware that the worst hours of their lives were approaching. By midday, the winds grew violent. Shingles tore from rooftops and spun through the air at deadly speeds. Telegraph lines snapped and crashed into the streets. When the last line fell, Galveston was cut off from the outside world. No warnings could reach the mainland, and no updates could get out. The hurricane now had total control of the island. As the afternoon advanced, water rushed across Galveston from both the Gulf side and the bay side. Floodwaters filled streets faster than people could react. Families tried to flee to higher ground, but the island was so flat that almost nowhere was safe. The water level rose with every passing minute. Carriages overturned, horses panicked. Debris flowed through the currents, smashing into homes and knocking people off their feet. Buildings began collapsing one after another. Houses that stood for decades crumbled under the force of the wind. Many people tried to move outdoors to reach sturdier shelters, but the air was filled with flying wood, metal, and shattered glass. Survivors later said the wind carried debris with such force that it could kill instantly. It is believed that many of the early deaths occurred during these hours when the city was still daylight, but already under assault by debris traveling at deadly speeds. Then came the storm surge. A powerful wall of water, estimated at 15 to 20 feet high, rose from the Gulf and swept across the island like a rolling mountain. It crushed entire blocks. Houses were lifted off their foundations and carried inland. All across Galveston, families were swallowed instantly by waves higher than the rooftops. The surge carried debris piles that became battering rams, slamming into buildings and destroying them from the outside in. Survivors later said the sound of the storm surge hitting the city was like an explosion stretching for miles. The St. Mary's Orphanage, located near the coast, suffered one of the most heartbreaking tragedies of the storm. More than 90 children and 10 nuns were inside when the water rose. The nuns tied the children together with rope, hoping that if the building collapsed, they would not be separated. But the surge struck with unstoppable force. The orphanage was destroyed, and only 3 children survived. The rest were swept into the dark water. Many bodies were never recovered. By nightfall, Galveston was in total darkness. The storm raged without pause. Rain and wind smashed into the city with overwhelming power. Those who survived the initial surge climbed onto debris piles and floating timbers, clinging through the night as the storm hurled them from one destroyed neighborhood to another. Many described drifting across the island in the darkness, hearing cries for help, but unable to move or see through the rain. Homes collapsed one after another. Families trapped inside drowned when the water rose to their ceilings. Countless lives were lost during these hours, carried away in the darkness or crushed beneath falling structures. Hour after hour, the storm maintained its strength. There was no break, no eye, no moment to breathe. Only after midnight did the winds begin to slowly weaken, though the water remained dangerously high. Survivors held on desperately, waiting for any sign of dawn. When the first light finally appeared in the sky on September 9th, Galveston had been changed forever. When the sun rose on September 9th, 1900, the survivors of Galveston saw a landscape that barely resembled the city they once knew. Morning light revealed destruction so complete that some people could not even identify their own neighborhoods. Streets that had once been lined with homes were buried under mountains of splintered wood, broken beams, shattered furniture, and twisted metal. Ships from the harbor rested blocks inland. Railroads were torn from the ground. Dead animals lay tangled in debris, and beneath the wreckage were the bodies of thousands of people who never survived the night. The silence that followed the storm was unsettling. No birds, no wagons, no streetcars, only the faint sound of survivors calling for help from beneath collapsed houses. Rescuers worked by hand, tearing apart debris to reach trapped families. In some cases, they found people still alive in pockets of air beneath the ruins, but far more often, they uncovered victims. Many had drowned when water rose too quickly for escape. Others were crushed as buildings collapsed around them. Some were killed by debris traveling faster than wind-thrown missiles. Because the city had been cut off from communication, the mainland had no idea how bad the situation was. Only when survivors walked down the damaged rail line to the mainland did word of the catastrophe spread. Once the scale of the disaster became known, rescue trains began arriving with workers, doctors, and supplies. But even then, they faced enormous challenges. Debris blocked every major road. The bridges and causeways were unstable. Supplies had to be carried by hand. Survivors at the center of the island had gone nearly 24 hours without food or clean water. The recovery efforts quickly became overwhelming. Bodies were everywhere, and the intense heat created the threat of disease. At first, workers attempted to load victims onto barges and bury them at sea, but the tides brought the bodies back to shore. The sight shocked the survivors. With no other options, officials made a difficult decision. They ordered crews to burn the bodies where they were found. For weeks, fires burned across the island as workers tried to prevent disease from spreading through the remains of the city. As the cleanup progressed, the full scale of the disaster became clear. Thousands of homes were destroyed. Entire families had vanished, swept out into the Gulf, or buried forever under debris. The official death count was impossible to determine accurately, but estimates range from 6,000 to 12,000. No other hurricane in American history has come close. Despite the tragedy, Galveston refused to disappear. Within weeks, city leaders began planning one of the most ambitious engineering projects in the nation's history. They would build a massive seawall to defend against future storms. Construction began in 1902 and continued for years. The seawall eventually stretched more than 10 miles long and rose 17 feet above sea level, but that was only the beginning. Engineers also designed a plan to raise the elevation of the entire city. They pumped millions of tons of sand underneath buildings, lifting some structures by as much as 16 feet. Homes were jacked up on wooden stilts while workers shoved sand beneath them. Streets were raised, sewer lines were rebuilt. The entire island was reshaped by human hands. It was a colossal effort, admired even today for its scope and execution. Yet, despite all these improvements, Galveston never regained its former status. Before the storm, it had been poised to become one of the most important cities in America. After the storm, investors and industries turned their attention to Houston, which was farther inland and less vulnerable to hurricanes. Over the following decades, Houston grew into a major port and economic powerhouse, while Galveston remained a smaller coastal city marked by its tragic history. The Galveston hurricane of 1900 changed more than just the island. It transformed the United States Weather Bureau. After the disaster, forecasters improved their methods, accepted international warnings more seriously, and rethought how storms move through the Gulf. The tragedy exposed the consequences of ignoring early signs and demonstrated the need for better communication and preparedness. Modern hurricane forecasting owes much of its development to the lessons learned from Galveston. Today, more than a century later, many Americans do not know that the deadliest hurricane in U.S. history struck a wealthy, confident city that believed it was safe. But Galveston remembers. The seawall still stands. Monuments honor the victims, and the island carries the memory of a night when nature showed its full power and thousands of lives were lost in darkness. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.